So in our prior class, we looked at the Great Depression, which is how some of you might characterize your high school years. That's historical humor. Not very good historical humor. But anyway, for this class, we're going to look at the decade of the 30s in a little more detail with an emphasis on FDR and his New Deal. So if you were absent, we started off class with a previously on and something that I hope got you thinking. Okay, so I posed the question, what were the 5 causes of the Great Depression? And there's no order to this, but hopefully you remembered the stock market crashing, inequality of wealth, overproduction of agriculture, war debts and reparations from the Treaty of Versailles, and protectionism, okay? And I hope you remember my analogy, a fist, not a flick. If you flick somebody with one finger, even if you're the heavyweight champion of the world, I don't think you can knock me out with one finger. Now, you put all 5 together, even somebody who's not that strong can knock somebody out, okay? You put them all together, it's much more damaging, okay, if you remember that. So those 5 causes were like the fist, okay? You put them all together and it knocked out the economy. Now, that's the previously on part. Now, the let's thinking part is I posed the question, what solutions would you propose to fix matters in the short and long term? So a little bit of brainstorming. So if you were absent, think about that. And then we got into the content. And we started off with some problems. Okay, Jay-Z had 99, and I think at the time we may have had even more than that. But 2 of the big ones, Hoovervilles. Now, Hoovervilles were these makeshift communities of people who were displaced, who did not have homes, and they set up shop wherever they could using building materials and whatever. And people had some dark humor. If you took your pockets out, those were Hoover flags, okay? And a newspaper became a Hoover blanket. So people were blaming the president at the time, a guy named Herbert Hoover, for the economic problems. And this was not good for him or anybody. Veterans marched to Washington to demand their bonuses that they were promised for fighting in World War I. And President Hoover turned against them and attacked them. That's not exactly good PR. So we're in a pretty dark spot starting out here. And then agriculturally speaking, the Dust Bowl, the weather really turned on us, and land that used to be fertile and able to grow crops became covered in dust and this picture, which caused people to have these mass migrations, and their nickname were Okies from Oklahoma. And this is maybe the most famous picture in U.S. history. If I didn't show you this in the course of a U.S. history class, I'm not doing my job. But this is Dorothea Lange's Migrant Mother. Now, this picture was taken in 1936 to show the desperation of these migrant people. Now, the woman here, Florence Thompson, on her tombstone even says migrant mother, you know, an example of American motherhood. She did live into her 80s. There's some good news for you. But this picture just shows the desperation and pain associated with this time. A picture says 1,000 words, and this one for sure does, okay? So let's look at this Herbert Hoover. Now, Herbert Hoover was ultimately blamed for the Great Depression. Okay, whether it's true or not, that's subject to debate. Now, he had laissez-faire capitalist policies pretty much that worked for his predecessors, worked for Coolidge and worked for Harding pretty much. But the economy changed. The Roaring Twenties came to an abrupt end. Now, as years go by, historians are seeing him more favorable than in the past. Now, if you were to talk about Hoover, say in the 1950s, oh, he was a bad guy. Now people are thinking he may have been in the wrong place at the wrong time, forces beyond his control, and his presidency is debated and controversial. A little broader point. When people look at a president in very absolutist terms, great president, bad president, best ever, worst ever, it's more complex than that, and time changes things up. I'm almost 50 years old, and in my life, I've seen presidents kind of lose their credibility and gain more credibility, and that's what makes history interesting, in my opinion. So anyway, Hoover's done. Hoover is not, he's persona non grata to the American people for the most part, okay? So a new guy comes in here. This is Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who will be called FDR from now on. Now, he was the only president to be elected 4 times, okay? Now, with the 22nd Amendment, this will never happen again. Nowadays, you can only serve 2 terms. And at the time, he was immensely popular. Now, in modern times, conservatives see his presidency as less than favorable. Progressives still feel he was a really good guy. But he was a complex guy. And I'll get this out of the way. I know you've heard the story that he did have polio. He was in a wheelchair. So you'll see him seated, and this is a picture of him with a little girl, very sweet picture. But even when he's standing, you'll notice he has his son to support him up. Okay, so it was an illusion. But people protected his privacy back then. It was a different time. Not in the age of social media. That would last about 2 seconds nowadays. So anyway, FDR, his first 100 days are considered maybe the gold standard in American presidential history, where he said, I'm going to get after it. Right out of the gates, I'm going to get after it. And during this time, he got several key pieces of legislation passed to put Americans back to work. Now, since him, the first 100 days has become a precedent where people say, what have you done in your first 100 days? So presidents feel a real pressure to get things going quickly based on FDR. And he got a lot done in 100 days. That is safe to say. And a tool that he used, a very effective tool, was something called the Fireside Chat. And he would give these very warm speeches to the people, almost like he was calling a friend or talking to friends. And he took very complex issues of government and in a very calm manner, very simple manner, explained it to the people. And this is the age of radio, okay? There was no TV. There was no alternative, multimedia at the time. So people would listen by the millions and listen to his talks, and it really solidified his popularity with a lot of the American people. Not all of the American people, but a lot, okay? Now, what he's best known for is the New Deal. Now, this is the term given for programs and legislation developed during his administration. Also, the nicknames alphabet soup or alphabet agencies, and you'll see why in a bit. The assignment for today's class is digging into that alphabet soup. And I will not ask you to memorize those because that's cruel. That is cruel. When I was in high school, I had to do that. And I'm a history teacher, mind you, and I found it very unpleasant. So I'm not going to do it to you. There you go. Now, how his New Deal applied to two minority groups. So if you look at American Indians, they had something called the Indian New Deal, and this was a series of policy changes, including the Indian Reorganization Act of 1934, that transformed government, Indian policy, and strengthened Indian tribal government of the reservations. And you see a picture here. And then he had a black cabinet. This was an informal network of high-level African-American officials and advisors to the Roosevelt administration who worked together to influence government policy. And a lot of people attribute that to his wife, Eleanor, who was very progressive for his time, certainly more racially progressive than her husband, but she influenced him. So that applied to those two groups. Now, not everybody was on board with FDR. Now, the American Liberty League was formed, and it was a very large, very well-funded organization to oppose the New Deal. They considered it un-American and socialist. And Father Charles Coughlin, who was an incredible orator, and I have a little personal story in a second here, was one of the biggest critics in or against FDR, and I'll share with you that personal story. You may have seen this. This is at 12 in Woodward. This is Shrine of the Little Flower, an enormous church. And at the very top here was a radio tower. Now, Father Coughlin was the priest there, and he would broadcast from this tower the #1 radio show in America. He received more mail than FDR, which explains Royal Oak has this enormous post office, and not a huge town, but it looks like a post office that would be in a major, major town. The reason why Father Coughlin back in the day received so much mail, they had to build this post office, which remains today in this thing. Now, here's my personal story. I used to be a parishioner at Shrine of the Little Flower, and years ago, about 20-something years ago, they had this enormous Christmas tree, and nobody wanted to put the star at the top, and I said, listen, I will risk my backside, put the star up if you let me see where Father Coughlin broadcast. And they let me do that, knowing I was a history teacher. And I did the thing. I risked my backside, put the star up, and I got to see where he broadcast. And he got pulled off the air for making anti-Semitic or anti-Jewish comments, and the radio station where it was just left untouched. It was very, very eerie. Now, I am no longer a parishioner at Shrine of the Little Flower. I'm no longer Catholic, actually. However, I do have that memory, and it's this enormous, beautiful church. So regardless of your religious persuasion, check it out. It's an architectural and historical jewel of Detroit. Okay, hope I wasn't too long-winded there. All right, so now that you have some basic background, here's the major assignment that we're going to be working on. I guess it's not major. Here's the main focus of today, I should say. So I'm going to ask you to click on this link. You can click on it on Google Classroom or here in the PowerPoint. And here's what I'm going to ask you to do. Using this chart, and it's interactive, provide me a biographical synopsis of both FDR and First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt, about them. What types of advisors did FDR utilize? So there's a key here, and I want you to pick an example for each of them to get a feel for what they provided. So what type of advisors did FDR utilize? And I got to give him credit for this. A leader's got to assemble a good team. And FDR, I think it's safe to say, assembled a very effective, very competent team. And then the last one, what major events transpired during the FDR administration, the purple boxes, and you can see them here, okay? So that was the focus of today, and hopefully you remembered what caused the Great Depression. You have a little background about Hoover and FDR, and that this interactive periodic table bears some fruit and helps you understand what was going on with the New Deal, because it's a lot. However, I will say it's very influential on today. Okay, I'm going to let you figure this out yourself, but at the end of this, you're going to be like, wow, a lot of these things are still with us. And I'll be like, absolutely they are. So FDR, his administration, whether you think they're good or bad, made a lot of changes. That is pretty much an airtight argument. So anyway, thank you for watching.